The wind across the township carries the scent of pine and progress, but on Martha's fence line, it carries only the heavy, sulphurous stench of the black mire. She stands alone at the edge of the property, her boots sinking into the soft, treacherous crust of the bog that has swallowed 40 acres of what used to be prime pasture. To the neighbors, that dark water is a cancer, a rotting wound on the face of the valley that ruins the view and devalues every acre nearby. They see a widow drowning in debt, clinging to a swamp that yields nothing but mosquitoes and bad luck. But Martha doesn't see a wasteland. She watches the slow, oily bubbles rise from the depths, feeling a pulse beneath the mud that no plow could ever reach. If you believe the earth still holds secrets for those willing to get their hands dirty, subscribe to Beyond the Fields. The vultures are already circling the marsh. The frost bit hard into the morning air, silvering the dead reeds that choked the edges of the bog. Martha stood on her back porch, a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee warming her calloused palms. She watched the sun struggle to climb over the ridge, its light hitting the standing water and turning it the color of old copper. It was a beautiful sight, if you didn't know the cost of it. That water had been rising for 3 years, ever since the great flood shifted the water table and turned her late husband's prized clover fields into a sodden, unworkable mess. The neighbors didn't just pity her, they resented her. To them, a farm was a machine meant to produce corn, soy, or beef. A farm that produced only stagnant water, and the smell of decay was a personal insult to the township's pride. Old Man Miller, who farmed the section to the west, had stopped pulling his tractor over to chat months ago. Now he just sped by in his shiny green John Deere, kicking up dust and pointedly looking the other way. He'd made it clear at the co-op that Martha's bog was a breeding ground for pests and a drain on the local tax base. He wanted her out, and he wasn't the only one. The struggle wasn't just with the neighbors, it was with the paper in her kitchen. The bank had sent another notice, this one printed on a shade of yellow that felt like a warning light. They didn't care about the 30 years her husband, Elias, had spent building the soil. They didn't care about the history of the house or the hand-carved banisters in the hallway. They saw a loan that wasn't being serviced and a collateral base that was literally dissolving into a swamp. Martha walked down the porch steps, her knees popping with the cold. Every step toward the bog felt like a step toward her own end. She reached the line where the solid turf gave way to the sponge-like moss. She knelt, plunging a gloved hand into the icy black sludge. It was thick, dense, and smelled of ancient things. People called it sour ground because nothing they valued would grow there. They tried to drain it, lime it, and kill it, but the bog fought back. It was a stubborn piece of the earth, just like she was. As she pulled her hand back, a clump of dark, fibrous peat clung to her fingers. It was heavy with the weight of centuries. To the bank, this was a liability. To the developers in the city, it was a nuisance. But Martha had been reading Elias's old journals, the ones he'd kept from his grandfather's time in the old country. There were mentions of the black water, of the things that survived when everything else withered. She spent her days walking the perimeter, measuring the depth with a long willow pole, and watching the way the light played across the surface. She was broke. Her pantry was thinning out to flour and lard, and the radiator in the living room leaked a steady hiss of steam she couldn't afford to fix. The world was shrinking down to this one patch of wet earth. She felt the eyes of the township on her back every time she went into town for supplies. They whispered about the widow who had lost her mind, the woman who stood in the rain watching a puddle grow. They didn't see the way the moss carpeted the ground in shades of emerald and rust that no paint could match. They didn't see the resilience of a land that refused to be tamed. The vultures finally made their presence known in the form of a black SUV that didn't belong on a gravel road. It sat at the end of her driveway, idling with a low, expensive hum. Martha didn't go out to meet it. She went back to her kitchen and put the kettle on. She knew what was coming. The township board had been meeting behind closed doors, talking about eminent domain and public health hazards. They wanted the bog gone, and they wanted her gone with it. She looked at the photo of Elias on the mantel. He was smiling, his hat tipped back, standing in a field of waist-high grass that no longer existed. She wondered what he would say about the mud. Probably that if the world gives you a swamp, you'd better start liking frogs. But Martha wasn't looking for company. She was looking for a way to stay. She felt the sourness of the ground in her very bones, a deep, aching cold that didn't go away even when she sat by the wood stove. The bank's letters grew more frequent, the tone shifting from concerned to predatory. They offered extensions that were really just ropes to hang herself with, adding interest upon interest. They knew she couldn't pay. They were just waiting for the bog to claim the last of the solid ground so they could take the whole carcass for a song. But the bog wasn't a grave, not yet. It was a dark, silent witness to her struggle, a mirror reflecting the gray sky and the hard, unyielding spirit of a woman who had nowhere else to go. She would hold on until the water took her, or until she found what the water was hiding. The man who stepped out of the black SUV looked like he had never seen a day of hard labor in his life. His suit was a charcoal silk that seemed to repel the dust of the driveway, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine that was an insult to the mud. He carried a leather briefcase like a shield, and walked with the practiced stride of someone who was used to being the most important person in the room. This was Julian Vane, a representative of a multi-state development firm that specialized in what they called land reclamation. Martha watched him through the screen door as he picked his way across the gravel, his face twisted in a look of mild disgust as the smell of the bog hit him. When he reached the porch, he didn't knock. He cleared his throat and waited, as if his presence alone were a summons. Martha opened the door slowly, her flannel shirt stained with grease, and her hair pulled back in a severe, practical knot. She didn't invite him in. She just stood there, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for him. Vane started with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. He spoke in a voice that was smooth as butter, full of rehearsed empathy and corporate jargon. He told her he understood her plight, that the township had expressed concerns about the environmental impact of her failing land. He called the bog a hazard, a blight on the community that was attracting invasive species and threatening the local water supply. He painted a picture of a generous way out, a chance for her to retire with a modest sum and leave the headache to professionals. His company, he explained, had a plan to turn the farm into a containment site for industrial runoff from the new manufacturing plant 10 miles up the river. They would line the bog with plastic, fill it with treated waste, and cap it with gravel. To him, the land was just a hole in the ground, a convenient place to hide the world's filth. He offered her a pittance, a fraction of what the land was worth back when it grew clover, and he acted like he was doing her a favor. Martha listened to him talk about chemical liners and runoff management, her eyes fixed on the way his silk tie fluttered in the breeze. He spoke of the earth as if it were a dead thing, a commodity to be bought, sold, and buried. He didn't see the life in the mire. He didn't see the way the bog filtered the rain and held the history of the valley. To Vane, the mud was just an obstacle to a balance sheet. He became increasingly condescending when Martha didn't immediately reach for his gold pen. He reminded her that the bank was losing patience. He mentioned his close relationship with the Township board and hinted that if she didn't take this deal, the land might be seized for a fraction of his offer. It was a threat wrapped in a velvet glove, the kind of bullying that powerful men use on those they deem insignificant. He looked at her rough hands and her tired eyes and assumed she was a broken woman looking for an exit. As he spoke, Martha felt a cold anger rising in her chest, an anger that was sharper and more focused than the grief she had carried for years. She looked past him toward the bog, where the dark water seemed to shimmer with a secret defiance. She thought about what it would mean to let this man pour chemicals into the heart of her home. It would be a betrayal of every season Elias had spent tending the fence lines. She didn't care about the money, not in the way Vane did. She cared about the integrity of the soil, even the parts that were underwater. She told him, in a voice that was quiet but as steady as a heartbeat, that her land wasn't for sale. Not to him, and not for a waste dump. Vane's smile faltered, replaced by a look of genuine shock. He tried to explain the logic of the market again, his tone shifting toward the impatient edge of a teacher dealing with a slow child. He told her she was being sentimental, and that sentimentality didn't pay the mortgage. He left her with a business card that felt like a curse, promising that his next visit wouldn't be so friendly. Martha watched the SUV retreat down the drive, the dust settling back onto the weeds. She knew she had just declared war on a man with infinite resources and the backing of the local government. She was a widow, with a failing farm and a rising swamp, standing against a tide of corporate greed and neighborly resentment. But as she walked back down to the water's edge that evening, she felt a strange sense of clarity. The developer had confirmed one thing: the land had value. He just didn't know what kind. He saw a dump, but the bog was something else entirely. It was an ancient, acidic furnace, breaking down matter into its purest elements. She realized then that the very thing the neighbors mocked and the developer wanted to destroy was her only weapon. She just had to figure out how to use it before the bank or the board took it away from her. The fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting the soul of the land from people who saw only the price tag. The following Tuesday was the monthly township meeting, a gathering usually reserved for debating road repairs and school budgets. But today, the air in the small wood-paneled hall was thick with a different kind of energy. Martha arrived late, wearing her best black dress, the one she'd worn to Elias's funeral. As she walked down the center aisle, the room went silent, then erupted into a low murmur of snickers and sharp whispers. She took a seat in the back, her back straight as a fence post. At the front of the room, Julian Vane sat next to the town supervisor, a man named Henderson who had owned the local hardware store for 40 years. They were leaning in close, sharing a joke that Martha knew was at her expense. When the meeting was called to order, it didn't take long for the conversation to turn to the property on the edge of the mire. Henderson stood up, clearing his throat with a self-important huff. He began to speak about the responsibilities of land ownership, about the duty each citizen had to maintain their property for the good of the whole. He used words like nuisance and liability, looking directly at Martha with a mixture of pity and contempt. He invited Vane to the podium, who played the part of the concerned benefactor to perfection. Vane spoke to the crowd of farmers and shopkeepers, telling them how his company wanted to revitalize the area, create jobs, and solve the problem of the stagnant marsh. He made it sound as if Martha's refusal to sell was a personal attack on the prosperity of every person in that room. He painted her as a delusional woman clinging to a rotting dream, a woman who would rather see the whole township suffer than admit she was beaten. The laughter started when a neighbor, a man who had borrowed Elias's tools for years, stood up and asked if Martha was planning on farming leeches or starting a mosquito ranch. The room erupted. People she had known her whole life, people who had sat in her kitchen and shared her bread, were now laughing at her. They saw her as a fool, a stubborn relic of a bygone era that was holding up progress. One by one, they stood up to voice their grievances. They complained about the smell, the drop in their property values, and the eyesore that the bog had become. They looked at her not as a neighbor in need, but as a hurdle to be cleared. Martha sat through it all, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't defend herself. She didn't shout. She just watched their faces, memorizing the shape of their betrayal. The humiliation reached its peak when Henderson asked Martha if she had anything to say in her defense. She stood up, her voice small in the large room, and said simply that the land had a right to be what it was. This was met with a chorus of groans and more mocking laughter. Vane shook his head, a patronizing smirk on his face, as if he were watching a tragedy unfold. He told the board that his offer would remain on the table for 48 hours, after which he would withdraw it and support the township in any legal action they chose to take to condemn the property. It was a public execution of her reputation. As she left the hall, people moved away from her in the aisles, as if her bad luck might be contagious. She walked out into the cool night air, the sound of their laughter still ringing in her ears like a bell. That night, Martha didn't go to bed. She sat on her porch and watched the moon reflect in the black water of the bog. The isolation was total now. The community had turned its back, the bank was closing in, and the powerful were lining up to strip her of the only thing she had left. She felt the weight of her failure, the crushing sense that she had let Elias down and lost the legacy they had built together. But in the depths of that despair, something shifted. The laughter of the town square had stripped away her last bit of hesitation. If she was already a fool in their eyes, she had nothing left to lose. She began to think about the bog not as a farm, but as a laboratory. She remembered the stories Elias's grandfather told of the black peat that could heal a wound or preserve a body for 1,000 years. She thought about the strange, hardy plants she had seen growing in the deepest parts of the mire, things that thrived on the very acidity that killed everything else. The world saw mud, but Martha began to see a harvest that no one else was brave enough to gather. She realized that the people in that room didn't understand the land at all. They only understood what they could control. The bog was wild, and she was the only one who knew how to speak its language. The transformation of the farm didn't happen with tractors or bright lights. It happened in the dead of night, with a rowboat and a hand-cranked auger. Martha spent weeks out on the dark water, her only companion the heavy mist that clung to the reeds. She was looking for a specific layer of peat, a deep, ancient vein that hadn't seen the sun in 5,000 years. She had sent samples away to a university in the city, using the last of her savings to pay for the analysis. When the results came back, The letter was signed by a professor who sounded breathless, even in his writing. The acidity of her bog was unique, a perfect balance of minerals and prehistoric plant matter that had created a rare, medicinal-grade peat known as sphagnum black gold. It was a substance used by high-end cosmetic firms and specialized medical labs for its incredible restorative properties. To the world of elite skincare and holistic medicine, what Martha had in her backyard was more valuable than a gold mine. She began the harvest in secret. It was back-breaking work, pulling the heavy, wet slabs of peat from the depths and hauling them to the barn to dry under carefully controlled conditions. She didn't use modern machinery that would crush the delicate structure of the moss. She used wooden tools she'd fashioned herself, following the old ways Elias's grandfather had described. The work was slow, and her body ached with a fatigue that went deeper than anything she'd felt in the clover fields. But every time she looked at the dark, rich mounds of peat drying in her barn, she felt a surge of triumph. She was no longer a widow drowning in a swamp. She was a guardian of a treasure that the people in town couldn't even imagine. She made contacts through the university, bypassing the local co-ops and the regional buyers. She went straight to the source, dealing with companies in Europe and Asia that didn't care about her neighbors' opinions or Julian Vane's plans. The first check that arrived in her mailbox was for more money than she and Elias had made in 5 years of farming. She didn't go to the local bank to deposit it. She drove 2 towns over, to a branch where no one knew her name or her history. She paid off the mortgage in one lump sum, the look on the clerk's face a small, sweet victory she kept to herself. But she didn't stop there. She kept harvesting, kept refining her process, and kept her silence. The neighbors still saw the same old woman and the same rotting bog. They didn't see the state-of-the-art filtration system she'd installed inside the old barn, or the refrigerated crates that were being picked up by unmarked trucks in the pre-dawn hours. Martha was becoming wealthy in the shadows, her fortune growing as steadily as the water had once risen. She watched from her porch as the township continued its campaign against her. Henderson and the board were moving forward with their plan to declare her land a public health hazard. They were confident, certain that she was a broken woman with no resources left. Julian Vane made several more visits, his offers getting lower each time, his tone more aggressive. He didn't understand why she wasn't panicking. He didn't see the way her shoulders had straightened or the new light in her eyes. He saw the same old flannel shirt and the same muddy boots. Martha played the part of the stubborn fool to perfection, letting them believe they were winning. She wanted them to commit, to put everything on the line before she showed her hand. She was learning the patience of the bog, the way it waits for things to settle before it claims them. The turning point came when a representative from a global pharmaceutical giant arrived at her door. They didn't come in a black SUV. They came in a modest rental car, and they spoke with a respect that Martha hadn't heard in years. They wanted to sign an exclusive contract for the rights to her peat, offering a sum that was staggering. They saw the bog for what it truly was, a biological miracle, a window into the past that could heal the future. Martha signed the papers, but she added her own conditions. She wasn't just selling a product, she was securing the land. The contract included a permanent environmental easement that would prevent the bog from ever being drained, filled, or polluted. She had used the wealth of the mire to ensure its survival. As she sat in her quiet kitchen that night, the weight of the years finally lifted. She had done it. She had saved the farm, not by fighting the water, but by embracing it. The laughter in the town square felt like a lifetime ago, a distant noise that could no longer reach her. She was the richest farmer in the township, and the best part was, they still didn't have a clue. The day of the final hearing was a cold, rainy Tuesday, much like the day of her humiliation months before. The township hall was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Julian Vane sat at the front, his briefcase open, looking like a man about to claim his prize. Henderson was at the podium, a gavel in his hand and a look of grim satisfaction on his face. They had it all prepared: the legal documents to seize the land, the signatures from the health department, and the contract with Vane's development firm already drafted. They were going to strip Martha of her heritage in front of the entire community, and they were going to call it progress. Martha walked in alone, her movements slow and deliberate. She took her seat in the back, watching as the machinery of small-town power ground into motion. Henderson began the proceedings with a long, rambling speech about the common good and the necessity of taking difficult actions for the benefit of the majority. He detailed the alleged dangers of the bog, the complaints from neighbors, and the failure of the owner to maintain the property. He called for a vote to finalize the seizure. It was a formality, a choreographed performance for a crowd that had already made up its mind. But before the vote could be taken, Martha stood up. This time, she didn't look like a victim. She walked to the front of the room, her boots echoing on the hardwood floor. She didn't ask for permission to speak. She simply waited until the room fell silent. She reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of documents, laying them on the table in front of Henderson. She told them, her voice clear and ringing in the quiet hall, that the property was no longer under their jurisdiction for seizure. She revealed the environmental easement, a legal ironclad protection backed by the state and federal government, designating the bog as a site of significant scientific and ecological importance. The room went dead silent. Vane's face turned a pale, sickly shade of gray. He scrambled to look at the papers, his hands shaking as he realized what he was looking at. Martha wasn't finished. She looked at Henderson and told him that she had recently acquired the outstanding debt on his hardware store and the township's municipal bond through a holding company she had established. She wasn't just a neighbor anymore. She was their primary creditor. The shock in the room was palpable. The people who had laughed at her, the neighbors who had turned their backs, were now looking at a woman who held their financial futures in her calloused hands. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stated the facts. The development project was dead. The bog would remain, protected by law and funded by the very substance they had called rot. Julian Vane tried to speak, to bluster his way out of the disaster, but Martha cut him off with a single, sharp look. She told him that his firm's presence in the valley was no longer required, and that any further attempts to trespass on her land would be met with the full force of the legal team her new partners provided. The man who had walked with such arrogance was now shrinking in his seat, his silk tie suddenly looking like a noose. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so violently that it felt as if the floor had tilted. Henderson looked down at the gavel in his hand as if it were a useless toy. He knew his store was failing, and he knew that Martha could call in his loans tomorrow if she chose. The crowd was silent, the mocking laughter replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable fear. They realized that the woman they had treated as a fool was the most powerful person in the county. Martha looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the men and women who had betrayed her. She saw the shame and the sudden desperate desire to be her friend again. She felt no satisfaction in their fear, only a deep, weary sadness for the community they could have been. She walked out of the hall before the meeting was even adjourned. She didn't need to stay for the vote. The game was over. As she stepped onto the porch, she saw the rain falling on the street, washing away the dust. She drove back to her farm, back to the quiet and the smell of the pine and the mire. The bog was still there, dark and mysterious, its surface ruffled by the raindrops. It had saved her, not by giving her what she wanted, but by being exactly what it was. The wealth she had gained was more than just numbers in a bank account. It was the freedom to live on her own terms, to honor the land that others had despised. She had shown the township that the earth doesn't care about their plans or their greed. It only yields its secrets to those who stay long enough to listen to the silence. The arrogance of the powerful had been met with the quiet resilience of the soil, and for the first time in a long time, the land was at peace. The bog remains, a dark mirror reflecting the shifting sky and the quiet strength of the woman who refused to let it go. Martha still walks the perimeter every evening, her boots finding the familiar paths through the moss and reeds. The neighbors don't laugh anymore. They keep their distance, watching from their porches with a mixture of awe and uneasy respect. They realize now that the value of a piece of ground isn't measured in bushels per acre or the height of a skyscraper, but in the depth of its roots and the secrets it keeps in the dark. The township has changed, the air a little cleaner, the pace a little slower, held together by the silent grace of a widow and her mire. True wealth isn't something you can buy with a silk tie or a corporate contract. It's something earned through the grit of the soul and the patience of the seasons. The land knows who belongs to it and who is just passing through. Martha stayed, and in the end, the earth gave her everything the world tried to take away. Beyond the fields, the dark water still flows, a testament to the power of the underdog.